Hi, my sweet friends, and welcome back to Crochet Every Day with Judy. We're continuing reading from Swiss Family Robinson, and we're starting today with Chapter 25, The Malabar Eagle, Sago Manufactory, Bees. My wife next morning began the conversation. She told me that the boys had been good and diligent, that they had ascended Cape Disappointment with her, and had gathered wood and made some torches for the night, and what seemed almost incredible, had ventured to fell and bring down an immense palm tree. It lay prostrate on the ground and covered a space of at least 70 feet in length. To effect their purpose, Fritz had got up the tree with a long rope which he fastened tight to the top of it. As soon as he had come down again, he and Ernest worked with the axe and saw to cut it through. When it was nearly divided, they carefully managed its fall with the rope, and in this manner they succeeded. Fritz was in high spirits, too, on another account. He brought me on his wrist a young bird of prey of the most beauteous plumage. He had taken it from the nest in one of the rocks near Cape Disappointment. Very young as the bird was, it had already all its feathers, though they had not yet received their full coloring. It answered to the description I had read of the beautiful eagle of Malabar, and I viewed it with the admiration it was entitled to. Meeting with one of these birds is thought a lucky omen, and it being neither large nor expensive in its food, I was desirous to keep it and train it like a falcon to pursue smaller birds. Fritz had already covered its eyes and tied a string to its foot, and I advised him to hold it often and for a length of time on his hand, and to tame it with hunger, as falconers do. When all the narratives were concluded, I ordered a fire to be lighted and a quantity of green wood to be put on it for the purpose of raising a thick smoke, over which I meant to hang the buffalo meat I had salted, to dry and preserve it for our future use. The young buffalo was beginning to browse, and we gave him also a little of the cow's milk, and in a few days we fed him with a heap of sliced roots which he greedily devoured, and this led us to conclude that the pains from the wound in his nose had subsided, and that he would soon become tame. The morning of this day was spent in again talking over our late extraordinary adventures. We left our meat suspended over the smoke of the fires during our sleep. We tied the young buffalo by the side of the cow, and were pleased to see them agree and bid fair to live in peace together. At night the dogs were set upon the watch. The time of repose elapsed so calmly that none of us awoke to keep in the torchlights, which now for the first time the industry of the boys had supplied us with, and we did not get up till after sunrise. After a moderate breakfast, I chanted the accustomed summons for our setting out, but my young ones had some projects in their heads, and neither they nor their mother were just then in the humor to obey me. "Let us reflect a little first," said my wife. "As we had so much difficulty in felling the palm tree, would it not be a pity to lose our labor by leaving it in this place? Ernest assures me it is a sago tree. If so, the pith would be an excellent ingredient for our soups. Do, my dear, examine it, and let us see if in any way we can turn it to account." I found she was in the right, but in that case it was necessary to employ a day in the business, since to lay open from one end to the other a tree of such length and substance was no trivial task. I, however, consented, as independent of the use of the farinaceous pith, I could, by emptying it, obtain 2 handsome and large troughs for the conveyance of water from Jackal's River to my wife's kitchen garden at Tent House, and thence to my new plantations of trees. I now desired them to bring me the graters they had used for the manioc, and observed that they had to assist me in raising the palm tree from the ground, which must be done, continued I, by fixing at each end 2 small cross pieces or props to support it. To split it open as it lies would be a work of too much labor. This done, I shall want several wooden wedges to keep the cleft open while I am sawing it, and afterwards a sufficient quantity of water. "There is a difficulty," said my wife. "Our Falcon Stream is too far off, and we have not yet discovered any spring in the neighborhood of this place." Ernest: "That is of no consequence, mother. I have seen hereabouts so great an abundance of plants which contain water that we need not be at a loss, for they will fully supply us, if I could only contrive to get vessels enough to hold it." We now produced the enormous reeds we had brought home, which, being hollow, would answer the purpose of vessels, and as some time was required to draw off the water from such small tubes, he and Francis at once set to work. They cut a number of the plants, which they placed slantingly over the brim of a vessel, and whilst that was filling, they were preparing another. The rest of us got round the tree, and with our united strength we soon succeeded in raising the heavy trunk, and the top of it was then sawn off. We next began to split it through the whole length, and this the softness of the wood enabled us to effect with little trouble. We soon reached the pith or marrow that fills up the middle of the trunk the whole of its length. When divided, we laid 1/2 on the ground, and we pressed the pith together with our hands so as to make temporary room for the pith of the other half of the trunk, which rested still on the props. We wished to empty it entirely that we might employ it as a kneading trough, leaving merely enough of the pith at both ends to prevent our running out, and then we proceeded to form our paste. My young manufacturers fell joyfully to work. They brought water and poured it gradually into the trough, whilst we mixed it with the flour. In a short time the paste appeared sufficiently fermented. I then made an aperture at the bottom of the grater on its outside and pressed the paste strongly with my hand. The farinaceous parts passed with ease through the small holes of the grater, and the ligneous parts, which did not pass, were thrown aside in a heap in the hope that mushrooms, etc., might spring from them. My boys were in readiness to receive in reed vessels what fell from the grater and conveyed it directly to their mother, whose business was to spread out the small grains in the sun upon sailcloth for the purpose of drying them. Thus we procured a good supply of a wholesome and pleasant food. The paste which remained was thrown upon the mushroom bed and watered well to promote a fermentation. We next employed ourselves in loading the cart with our tools in the two halves of the tree. Night coming on, we retired to our hut, where we enjoyed our usual repose, and early next morning we were ready to return to Falcon Stream. Our buffalo now commenced his service yoked with the cow. He supplied the want of the ass and was very tractable. It is true, I led him by the cord in his nose, and thus restrained him whenever he was disposed to deviate from his duty. We returned the same way as we came, in order to load the cart with the provision of berries, wax, and elastic gum. I sent forward Fritz and Jack as a vanguard with one of the dogs. They were to cut an ample road through the bushes for our cart. The two water conductors, which were very long, produced numerous difficulties and somewhat impeded our progress. We reached the wax and gum trees with tolerable speed and without any accident, and halted to place our sacks of berries in the cart. The elastic gum had not yielded as much as I expected from the too rapid thickening caused by an ardent sun. We obtained, however, about a quart, which sufficed for the experiment of the impenetrable boots I had so long desired. We set out again, still preceded by our pioneers, who cleared the way for us through the little wood of guavas. Suddenly we heard a dreadful noise, which came from our vanguard, and beheld Fritz and Jack hastening toward us. I began now to fear a tiger or panther was near at hand, or had perhaps attacked them. Turk began to bark so frightfully, and Flora joined in so hideous a yell, that I prepared myself for a conflict. I advanced at the head of my troop to the assistance of my high-mettled dogs, who ran furiously up to a thicket where they stopped, and with their noses to the ground, and almost breathless, strove to enter it. I had no doubt some terrible animal was lurking there, and Fritz, who had seen it through the leaves, confirmed my suspicion. He said it was about the size of the young buffalo, and that his hair was black and shaggy. I was going to fire promiscuously into the thicket when Jack, who had thrown himself on his face in the ground to have a better view of the animal, got up in a fit of laughter. "It is only," exclaimed he, "our old sow, who is never tired of playing off her tricks upon us." Half vexed, half laughing, we broke into the midst of the thicket, where in reality we found our old companion stretched supinely on the earth, but by no means in a state of dreary solitude. She had round her 7 little creatures, which had been littered a few days, and were sprawling about, contending with each other for the best place near their mother for a hearty meal. This discovery gave us considerable satisfaction, and we all greeted the good matron, who seemed to recollect and welcome us with a sociable kind of grunting, while she licked her young without any ceremony or show of fear. And now a general consultation took place. Should this new family be left where we found it, or conveyed to Falcon Stream? Opinions being at variance, it was decided that for the present the sow and her young should keep quiet possession of their retreat. We then, so many adventures ended, pursued our road and arrived at Falcon Stream in safety, experienced what is so generally true, that home is always dear and sacred to the heart, and anticipated with delight. All was in due order, and our animals welcomed our return in their own jargon and manner, but which did not fail to be expressive of their satisfaction at seeing us again. We threw them some of the food they were most partial to, which they greedily accepted, and then voluntarily went back to their usual stand. It was necessary to practice a measure dictated by prudence, which was to tie up the buffalo again, to inure it by degrees to confinement, and the handsome Malabar eagle shared the same fate. Fritz chose to place it near the parrot on the root of a tree. He fastened it with a piece of pack thread of sufficient length to allow it free motion, and uncovered its eyes. Till then the bird had been tolerably quiet, but the instant it was restored to light, it fell into a species of rage that surprised us. It proudly raised its head, its feathers became ruffled, and its eyeballs seemed to whirl in their orbits and dart out vivid lightnings. All the poultry were terrified and fled, but the poor luckless parrot was too near the sanguinary creature to escape. Before we were aware of the danger, it was seized and mangled by the formidable hooked beak of the eagle. Fritz vented his anger in loud and passionate reproaches. He would have killed the murderer on the spot, had not Ernest run up and entreated him to spare its life. "Parrots," said he, "we shall find in plenty, but never perhaps so beauteous, so magnificent a bird as this eagle, which, as father observes, we may train for hawking. You may, too, blame only yourself for the parrot's death. Why did you uncover his eyes? I could have told you that falconers keep them covered 6 weeks, till they are completely tamed. But now, brother, let me have the care of him. Let me manage the unruly fellow. He shall soon, in consequence of the methods I shall use, be as tractable and submissive as a newborn puppy." Fritz refused to part with his eagle, and Ernest did not long oppose giving him the information he wanted. "I have read," said he, "somewhere that the Caribs puff tobacco smoke into the nostrils of the birds of prey and of the parrots they catch until they are giddy and almost senseless. This stupefaction over, they are no longer wild and untractable." Fritz resolved on the experiment. He took some tobacco and a pipe, of which we had plenty in the sailors' chests, and began to smoke, at the same time gradually approaching the unruly bird. As soon as it was somewhat composed, he replaced the fillet over the eyes and smoked close to its beak and nostrils so effectually that it became motionless on the spot and had the exact air of a stuffed bird. Fritz thought it dead and was inclined to be angry with his brother, but I told him it would not hold on the perch if it were lifeless, and that its head alone was affected, and so it proved. The favorite came to itself by degrees and made no noise when its eyes were unbound. It looked at us with an air of surprise but void of fury, and grew tamer and calmer every day. We next began a business which I and my wife had been thinking of for some time. She found it difficult and even dangerous to ascend and descend our tree with a rope ladder. We never went there but on going to bed, and each time felt an apprehension that one of the children, who scrambled up like cats, might make a false step and perhaps be lame forever. Bad weather might come on and compel us for a long time together to seek an asylum in our aerial apartment, and consequently to ascend and descend oftener. My wife had repeatedly applied to me to remedy this evil, and my own anxiety had often made me reflect if the thing were really possible. A staircase on the outside was not to be thought of. The considerable height of the tree rendered that impracticable, as I had nothing to rest it on and should be at a loss to find beams to sustain it. But I had for some time formed the idea of constructing winding stairs within the immense trunk of the tree, if it should happen to be hollow, or I could contrive to make it so. I had heard the boys talking of a hollow in our tree, and of a swarm of bees issuing from it, and I now, therefore, went to examine whether the cavity extended to the roots, or what its circumference might be. The boys seized the idea with ardor. They sprang up and climbed to the top of the roots like squirrels, to strike at the trunk with axes, and to judge from the sound how far it was hollow. But they soon paid dearly for their attempt. The whole swarm of bees, alarmed at the noise made against their dwelling, issued forth, buzzing with fury, attacked the little disturbers, began to sting them, stuck to their hair and clothes, and soon put them to flight, uttering lamentable cries. My wife and I had some trouble to stop the course of their uproar and cover their wounds with fresh earth to allay the smart. Jack, whose temper was on all occasions rash, had struck fiercely upon the bees' nest and was more severely attacked by them than the rest. It was necessary, so serious was the injury, to cover the whole of his face with linen. The less active Ernest got up the last and was the first to run off when he saw the consequences, and thus avoided any further injury than a sting or two. But some hours elapsed before the other boys could open their eyes or be in the least relieved from the acute pain that had been inflicted. When they grew a little better, the desire of being revenged of the insects that so roughly used them had the ascendant in their minds. They teased me to hasten the measures for getting everything in readiness for obtaining possession of their honey. The bees, in the meantime, were still buzzing furiously round the tree. I prepared tobacco, a pipe, some clay, chisels, hammers, etc. I took the large gourd long intended for a hive and fitted a place for it by nailing a piece of board on a branch of the tree. I made a straw roof for the top to screen it from the sun and rain, and as all this took up more time than I was aware of, we deferred the attack of the fortress to the following day and got ready for a sound sleep which completed the cure of my wounded patients. Chapter 26, Treatment of Bees, Staircase, Training of Various Animals, Manufactures, etc. Next morning, almost before dawn, all were up and in motion. The bees had returned to their cells, and I stopped the passages with clay, leaving only a sufficient aperture for the tube of my pipe. I then smoked as much as was requisite to stupefy without killing the little warlike creatures. Not having a cap with a mask, such as bee catchers usually wear, nor even gloves, this precaution was necessary. At first a humming was heard in the hollow of the tree, and a noise like the gathering tempest, which died away by degrees. All was become calm, and I withdrew my tube without the appearance of a single bee. Fritz had got up by me. We then began with a chisel and a small axe to cut out of the tree under the bee's hole of entrance a piece 3 feet square. Before it was entirely separated, I repeated the fumigation lest the stupefaction produced by the first smoking should have ceased, or the noise we had been just making revived the bees. As soon as I supposed them lulled again, I separated from the trunk the piece I had cut out, producing, as it were, the aspect of a window, through which the inside of the tree was laid open to view, and we were filled at once with joy and astonishment on beholding the immense and wonderful work of this colony of insects. There was such a stock of wax and honey that we feared our vessels would be insufficient to contain it. The whole interior of the tree was lined with fine honeycombs. I cut them off with care and put them in the gourds the boys constantly supplied me with. When I had somewhat cleared the cavity, I put the upper combs in which the bees had assembled in clusters and swarms into the gourd which was to serve as a hive and placed it on the plank I had purposely raised. I came down, bringing with me the rest of the honeycombs, with which I filled a small cask, previously well washed in the stream. Some I kept out for a treat at dinner, and we had the barrel carefully covered with cloths and planks, that the bees, when attracted by the smell, might be unable to get at it. We assembled round the table and regaled ourselves plentifully with the delicious treat. My wife then put by the remainder, and I proposed to my sons to go back to the tree to prevent the bees from swarming again there on being roused from their stupor, as they would not have failed to do but for the precaution I took of placing a board at the aperture and burning a few handfuls of tobacco on it, the smell and smoke of which drove them back whenever they attempted to return. At length they desisted and became gradually reconciled to their new residence, where their queen, no doubt, had settled herself. I now advised that all should watch during the night over the whole provision of honey obtained while the bees were torpid, who, when recovered, would not fail to be troublesome and come in legions to get back to their property, and to this end we threw ourselves on our beds in our clothes to take an early doze. On awakening about nightfall, we found the bees quiet in the gourd, or settled in clusters upon near branches, so we went expeditiously to business. The cask of honey was emptied into a kettle, except a few prime combs, which we kept for daily consumption. The remainder, mixed with a little water, was set over a gentle fire and reduced to a liquid consistence, strained and squeezed through a bag, and afterwards poured back into the cask, which was left upright and uncovered all night to cool. In the morning the wax was entirely separated and had risen to the surface in a compact and solid cake that was easily removed. Beneath was the purest, most beautiful and delicate honey that could be seen. The cask was then carefully headed again and put into cool ground near our wine vessels. This task accomplished, I mounted to revisit the hive and found everything in order, the bees going forth in swarms and returning loaded with wax, from which I judged they were forming fresh edifices in their new dwelling place. I had been surprised that the numbers occupying the trunk of the tree should find room in the gourd, till I perceived the clusters upon the branches, and I thence concluded a young queen was among each of them. In consequence, I procured another gourd into which I shook them and placed it by the former. Thus I had the satisfaction of obtaining at an easy rate 2 fine hives of bees in activity. Soon after these operations, we proceeded to examine the inside of the tree. I sounded it with a pole from the opening I had made, and a stone fastened to a string served us to sound the bottom and thus to ascertain the height and depth of the cavity. To my great surprise, the pole penetrated without any resistance to the branches on which our dwelling rested, and the stone descended to the roots. The trunk, it appeared, had wholly lost its pith, and most of its wood internally. It seems that this species of tree, like the willow in our climates, receives nourishment through the bark, for it did not look decayed, and its far extended branches were luxuriant and beautiful in the extreme. I determined to begin our construction in its capacious hollow that very day. The undertaking appeared at first beyond our powers, but intelligence, patience, time, and a firm resolution vanquished all obstacles. We began to cut into the side of the tree toward the sea, a doorway equal in dimensions to the door of the captain's cabin, which we had removed with all its framework and windows. We next cleared away from the cavity all the rotten wood, and rendered the interior even and smooth, leaving sufficient thickness for cutting out resting places for the winding stairs without injuring the bark. I then fixed in the center the trunk of a tree about 20 feet in length and a foot thick, completely stripped of its branches, in order to carry my winding staircase round it. On the outside of this trunk and the inside of the cavity of our own tree, we formed grooves so calculated as to correspond with the distances at which the boards were to be placed to form the stairs. These were continued till I had got to the height of the trunk round which they were turned. I made 2 more apertures at suitable distances, and thus completely lighted the whole ascent. I also effected an opening near our room, that I might more conveniently finish the upper part of the staircase. A second trunk was fixed upon the first, and firmly sustained with screws and transverse beams. It was surrounded like the other with stairs cut slopingly, and thus we happily effected the stupendous undertaking of conducting it to the level of our bedchamber. Here I made another door directly into it. To render it more solid and agreeable, I closed the spaces between the stairs with plank. I then fastened 2 strong ropes, the one descending the length of the central trunk, the other along the inside of our large tree, to assist in case of slipping. I fixed the sash windows taken from the captain's cabin in the apertures we had made to give light to the stairs, and I then found I could add nothing further to my design. I have now to relate some occurrences that took place during the construction of our staircase. A few days after the commencement of our undertaking, our brave Flora whelped us 6 young puppies, all healthy, and likely to live. The number was so alarming that I was under the necessity of drowning all but a male and a female to keep up the breed. A few days later, the 2 she-goats gave us 2 kids, and our ewes 5 lambs, so that we now saw ourselves in possession of a pretty flock. Next to the winding stairs, my chief occupation was the management of the young buffalo, whose wound in the nose was quite healed, so that I could lead it at will with a cord or stick passed through the orifice, as the Caffrarians do. I preferred the stick, which answered the purpose of a bit, and I resolved to break in the spirited beast for riding as well as drawing. It was already used to the shafts and very tractable in them. But I had more trouble in inuring him to a rider and to wearing a girth, having made one out of an old buffalo's hide. I formed a sort of saddle with sailcloth and tacked it to the girth. Upon this I fixed a burden which I increased progressively. I was indefatigable in the training of the animal, and soon brought it to carry patiently large bags of roots, salt, and other articles in the place of the ass. The monkey was his first rider, who stuck so close to the saddle that in spite of the plunging and kicking of the buffalo, it was not thrown. Francis was then tried as the lightest of the family, but throughout his excursion I led the beast with a halter, that it might not throw him off. Jack now showed some impatience to mount the animal in his turn. I next passed the stick through the buffalo's nose, and tied strong pack thread at each end of it, bringing them together over the neck of the animal, and put this newfangled bridle into the hands of the young rider, directing him how to use it. For a time the lad kept his saddle, notwithstanding the unruly gestures of the creature. At length a side jolt threw him on the sand, without his receiving much injury. Ernest, Fritz, and lastly myself got on successively, with more or less effect. His trotting shook us to the very center, the rapidity of his gallop turned us giddy, and our lessons in horsemanship were reiterated many days before the animal was tamed, and could be ridden with either safety or pleasure. At last, however, we succeeded without any serious accident, and its strength and swiftness of our saddled buffalo were prodigious. It seemed to sport with the heaviest loads. My 3 eldest boys mounted it together now and then, and it ran with them with the swiftness of lightning. We now began to think of manufacturing our impenetrable boots without seams, of the caoutchouc or elastic gum. I began with a pair for myself, and I encouraged my children to afford a specimen of their industry by trying to form some flasks and cups that could not break. They began by making some clay molds, which they covered with layers of gum, agreeably to the instructions I had given them. In the meanwhile, I filled a pair of stockings with sand and covered them with a layer of clay, which I first dried in the shade and afterwards in the sun. I then took a sole of buffalo leather, well beaten, and studded round with tacks, which served me to fix it under the foot of the stocking. After this, I poured the liquid gum into all the interstices, which on drying produced a close adhesion between the leather and stocking sole. I next proceeded to smear the whole with a coat of resin of a tolerable thickness, and as soon as this layer was dried on, I put on another, and so on, till I had applied a sufficiency with my brush. After this, I emptied the sand, drew out the stocking, removed the hardened clay, shook off the dust, and thus obtained a pair of seamless boots, as finished as if made by the best English workman, being pliant, warm, soft, smooth, and completely waterproof. We had also been engaged in the construction of our fountain, which afforded a perpetual source of pleasure to my wife, and indeed to all of us. In the upper part of the stream we built with stakes and stoves a kind of dam that raised the water sufficiently to convey it into the palm tree troughs, and afterwards, by means of a gentle slope, to glide on contiguous to our habitation, where it fell into the tortoiseshell basin which we had elevated on stones to a certain height for our convenience, and it was so contrived that the redundant water passed off through a cane pipe fitted to it. I placed 2 sticks athwart each other for the gourds that served as pails to rest on, and we thus produced close to our abode an agreeable fountain, delighting with its rill, and supplying us with a pure crystal fluid, such as we frequently could not get when we drew our water from the bed of the river, which was often encumbered with the leaves and earth fallen into it, or rendered turbid by our waterfowls. We'll stop there and start next time with Chapter 27. Thank you for listening. Bye-bye.